We're ready for part two of our introduction to high leverage practices, explicit instruction, and writing conditions for IEP goals. So, what we're going to do is start by looking at HLP 18. And that HLP is use strategies to promote active student engagement. So, what are we doing? We are promoting active student engagement. And so, what does that mean? It means that students are mentally, they're physically, and they are socially involved in learning. And so we want to make sure that we're meeting all of those needs of our students because when our students are actively engaged and participating in their learning, then it helps to promote skills acquisition. It improves retention and it supports generalization. And remember, generalization is transferring those skills to different contexts. And so when we're thinking about active engagement, it's more than just answering questions. It's more than just manipulating materials. Students are actively engaged. And so if we look at this picture, let's look at this student. Does he look like he's actively engaged in learning? All right, let's look at this student. Does he look like he's actively engaged in learning? I just visually can see a difference in the engagement of those two students. Now let's look at another one. Let's look at these students. What about this student? She's engaged. These students are engaged. They're working together. And this student is engaged. And that's what we're aiming for, that all students are actively engaged and participating in their education. So there are different types of active engagement, and we're going to talk about each one. Notice there's a little star up in the corner. So the first one is cognitive engagement, and that's where students are thinking or they're processing. And that could be things like they're making connections between concepts. They're explaining their reasoning, and that could be done verbally. It could be done through gestures. It could be done in an AAC as an augmentative and alternative communication device. They could be using that for students who are not vocal communicators. They could be doing things like comparing or categorizing, analyzing, or solving problems and making decisions during activities. So let's look at what an example of cognitive active engagement would be. It could be that in science you're doing a lesson on ecosystems and you're talking about the ocean, and students have had an opportunity to choose two different marine animals, and then they're going to compare and contrast them using a Venn diagram. So that comparing and that contrasting has them thinking and they're processing. All right. Another type of active engagement is behavioral engagement. And that's when students are doing something or they're responding. So they could be doing things like manipulating materials. You might be talking about how much weight a structure could bear, and they're using blocks to do that, or they're responding with response cards. With the blocks, you would be building a structure and then putting weight on it. They could be responding to teachers' prompts with different actions. Maybe you have them clapping, maybe you have them pointing. They could be taking turns in group activities or participating in role plays or simulations. So you can see these are just a couple of examples of students doing or responding, which is behavioral active engagement. And that might be something like in math, they're using manipulatives. And by using those manipulatives, they are doing, and they could use those manipulatives to respond by using the manipulatives to demonstrate, for example, 3 minus 1. All right, next type star of active engagement is social engagement. And obviously, that's when it's exactly what it sounds like. Students are interacting with others. They're interacting with the teacher, they're interacting with their peers, they're collaborating, they're observing and imitating different models. They could be having a discussion or retelling a story, sharing a reading, or they could be using communication devices, those AAC devices, to interact with their peers. Again, actively engage with others in a social way that supports learning. And that could be something like this. And these are three students who are working together on a science project, and they're talking about the benefits of something. All right, the last one is sensory or exploratory active engagement. And this is when students, again, they're engaging with or exploring different sounds, different textures. They have visuals that they're engaging with that are supporting their learning, or they could be engaged in some kind of a movement-based activity that is directly tied to what you're teaching. Something like hopping with an ABA pattern. So it could be hop out, hop in, hop out, hop in, and that would be A, B, A, B, for example. Or another example might be that you're teaching multiplication and you're doing it through skip counting, and you have a mat, and the student is actually involved in moving from one number to the next as they skip count. So those are examples of active engagement, but I also want to give you non-examples. And so example, non-example is a really effective research-based instructional strategy. So you give students an example, this is what this skill or this concept looks like, and then you give a non-example, this is what it does not look like. So non-examples, you embed this in your lessons. It's a really effective strategy. So non-examples of active engagement would be a student listening to a lecture for some extended period of time and they're not responding or participating. That would be listening to a video almost, right? But we're asynchronous, so it's a little bit different. Could be copying notes word for word, but they're not doing any processing. They're not discussing any of the information that they're writing about. They could watch a video, but they're not answering any questions. They're not discussing anything or interacting with the content or others about the content. It could be that they're completing just repetitive worksheets and they've just done it so many times it's just automatic. Again, they're not really thinking, they're not really in that application stage. Or they could just be waiting quietly as one student responds to all of the different questions. And none of those examples is the student actively engaged in learning. And that's not what we want. Those are non-examples. So, what I want you to do now, number 3, remember to write on the first line. I want you to write 3 examples of what active engagement could look like in your future classroom. And you can use examples that you've seen, or you could use your own ideas and come up with something on your own. So, go ahead, stop the video, write those 3 examples, and then come back and we'll move forward. All right, I look forward to seeing your examples. So, want to let you know in class what you're going to do. You are going to look at a complete explicit lesson plan, explicit instruction lesson plan. And what you're going to do is in your group, you're going to go through each of the components of the lesson plan, and you are going to look for active engagement, times in which the students are actively engaged in learning. So you're going to identify those, and then you're going to share out what you find, okay? So make sure that before you come to class, look over here, skim through the lesson plan on Canvas, because you want to have read through it, skim through it before you come to class and work in a group. All right, so again, when we're talking about that explicit instruction lesson plan, let me say that we have these in one order, but you may have them, you may come in and do the attention getter and then state the objective. All 3 of these components need to be present. You're going to always start with the attention getter. You're going to always end with the preview, but sometimes you may see what's in between in a different order. But you're going to get those students' attention. You're going to actively engage them in a review. You're going to tell them what they're going to learn by stating the objective. You're going to share why those skills are important by sharing the relevance. Remember, with the relevance, it's not just you sharing, it's them sharing as well. How would you think you could use this skill in the future? And then you're going to do a preview to share with them what they can expect, what they're going to do in the upcoming lesson, and what that looks like, how they're supposed to respond, for example. You're then going to move to the body. You're going to do that I do, where the teacher is modeling what that behavior or skill looks like as they do a think aloud. So when you're modeling, you're not just standing up there and modeling, you're actually talking through out loud what your thought process is. After you have modeled, you're going to move to that we do, where you're working and the students working, everybody's working together. You're doing that guided practice and you're scaffolding from high support, fading that down to moderate support, fading that by reducing it to low support until you fade out all support and students are able to do it independently. And at that point, they're going to move into the you do section of your lesson, lesson where they're engaged in independent practice, because remember, that practice is what really supports acquisition, retention, and generalization of that skill. Always ending with reviewing the critical information. We want to go back over what we've talked about. Let's just wrap this up like a sweet little package. You're going to preview the next lesson so they know, hey, here's what's to come, and they can prepare for that. And then you're going to assign that independent work either later in the day, in the morning, or for homework. And then you're going to regularly, on a schedule, come back and do a maintenance check, because we want to make sure that the students maintain the skills, that we don't teach it and walk away from it forever. We're constantly coming back and doing that maintenance check. All right, so let's look at what John Holt had to say. So when he talked about learning, he said learning is not the product of teaching. I want you to hear that. Learning is not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of learners. The way students learn is through active engagement. It's not you standing up there teaching, it is you teaching and them being actively engaged. So when we're thinking about our students and how we teach them and what they learn, we want to look at, like, what does it look like if students are engaged what's called passive learning? And that would be things like lectures, when you're reading something, an audio visual type of thing like a movie, or demonstrations. So when a student receives a lecture, they typically or retain about 5% of what you've taught. That's why throughout the videos I have you answer the questions. I'm having you engage with the content, because if I lecture, you can get about 5% of it. With reading, it's about 10%. When there's some type of visual audio component, it's typically 20%. And then when a student watches a demonstration, it's usually about 30%. So that's about 30% of what you're trying to teach your students when they are engaged in passive learning. Now, I want you to look at this. Look at this switch. When our students are actively engaged in discussions, they are acquiring about 50% of that content. When you have them practice and they're doing something, it's about 75%. So when I say write 3 examples of how you might have students actively engage, I'm having you practice that doing right there. And then when you teach others, oh wait, we're coming back and we're teaching others. You heard me talk about that. You're hitting about 90%. So when you think about the activities that we do when we're in our synchronous class, I want you to see that you are in active learning. You are actively engaged in your learning, because we want you to be at that higher level of acquisition and retention. All right, so in group, you're going to be doing a brainstorm. You're going to sit with your group, and you're going to talk about what kind of activities and strategies or techniques could you use to keep your students engaged. And we're going to do a brainstorm of that in class. All right, let's do a quick check-in, see how you're doing. You're going to check your own understanding. You got it? Almost there? Need some help? As always, please, please, please. I welcome any and all questions. Any and all questions I want, okay? All right, I'll see you in the next video.